Welcome to Emovura Audiobooks, your home for immersive, narrated stories that pull you in and don't let go. Before we begin, if you enjoy this story, take a moment to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's story, Leatherwood. The road into Hartley's Reach still climbs through 40 minutes of hairpin bends before the bush opens up and you see the town sitting in its bowl of bare, rust-colored hills, the old smelter stack standing over it like something that refuses to fall down out of spite. I hadn't driven that road in 4 years, not since I filed my last dispatch on the case and told myself I was done chasing it. But there I was again, parking behind the courthouse in the same drizzle that seems to fall on this part of the island 300 days out of the year, walking past the same pub with the same optimistic chalkboard advertising a Sunday roast nobody was thinking about that week. I'd made that drive so many times over the years that my hands still knew the bends before my eyes caught up to them. The long left-hand sweep past the old flotation plant, the dip where the creek runs under the road and floods it twice a winter, the last rise where the town finally shows itself, small and stubborn, like it's daring you to leave again. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because it matters for what follows. I didn't come to Hartley's Reach as a stranger chasing a headline. I came here 9 years ago as a 26-year-old regional reporter sent to cover a rezoning dispute over a proposed fish farm in the estuary, a story so small it ran 400 words on page 11, and I kept coming back long after any editor would have justified the petrol money, because somewhere in those first few visits the town got its hooks into me the way certain places do, quietly, without your permission. I covered the smelter's slow decline and the arguments over whether the council could afford to keep the pool open through winter. I covered a bushfire that came within 2 paddocks of the primary school. And in the 3rd year I lived here, part-time in a weatherboard rental above the old chemist, I started covering 3 young people going missing one after another in a pattern that took the whole town more than 2 years to admit was a pattern at all. Des Coventry was the first of them, and for a long while nobody outside his own family treated his disappearance as anything but ordinary. He was 22, wiry and restless in the way some kids get when a small town has already shown them everything it has to offer twice over, and he worked odd shifts at the abattoir out on the highway when he worked at all. He'd gone missing before, for a week here, 10 days there, usually turning up in Queenstown or crashing on a mate's floor in Zeehan after a fight with his father. So when he didn't answer his phone for a fortnight in that first autumn, most people, including, I'll admit, most of the local police, assumed he'd done what he always did. It was 11 months before a party of bushwalkers found what was left of him at the bottom of an abandoned mine added up past the old cableway, a shaft sunk into the hillside back when the company still thought there was tin left worth chasing. The coroner's finding was a masterpiece of institutional caution, a fall, consistent with intoxication, unable to exclude the involvement of a third party, unable to confirm it either. I remember standing in the car park after that inquest with Des's father, a big, silent man named Wal Coventry, who told me he didn't need a coroner to tell him his son didn't walk himself into a hole in the ground he'd been afraid of since he was a boy, because Des was afraid of the old workings the way other kids were afraid of dogs. Nobody listened to Wal Coventry for the better part of a year. I'm not sure anybody's properly listened to him since. Flynn Kessler went the following autumn, and by then the town had started to feel the shape of something even if nobody could name it yet. Flynn was 24, worked the maintenance crew at the old flotation plant when there was work going, and was, by every account I ever gathered, the kind of person small towns like to hold up as proof they haven't lost everything, funny in a way that didn't need an audience, hopeless with money, devoted to his mother Deborah in a manner that embarrassed him slightly in front of his mates. He and Levi Marchetti had grown up 2 streets apart and fished together most winters of their lives. There's a photo that ran in the local paper years before any of this. the two of them grinning over a decent haul of flathead off the wharf that got dragged back out and reprinted so many times during the trial that I stopped being able to look at it without feeling ill. Flynn had also, for a period of some months before he disappeared, been seeing Ruby Anstey on and off, in the loose, undefined way that people in their 20s in small towns tend to see each other, and there was history there too. Ruby and Levi had a brief thing themselves, 2 or 3 years earlier, that ended badly enough that people still brought it up unprompted when you asked them about the group. I mention it now because the Crown would spend a great deal of the trial trying to decide how much weight that tangled small history was allowed to carry, and because Wark Styles would spend just as much energy trying to convince a jury it explained everything. Ruby Anstey was the last of the 3 to vanish, 16 months after Flynn, and hers was the disappearance that finally made outsiders sit up, because unlike the 2 boys, she left something behind. A single text message, sent to a friend at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, that read, "Only home, soon, don't wait up," then nothing at all, ever again, from a phone that was never recovered. Her mother, Pam, always maintained the message didn't sound like Ruby, that her daughter never wrote "Don't wait up." She wrote "Go to bed, you muppet." That whoever sent that text was trying to sound like Ruby and got the register wrong the way an impersonator always does, a half tone off from the real thing. Ruby was 23, worked behind the bar at the pub with a chalkboard, and had, by the accounts of nearly everyone who knew her, a temper that ran hot and burned out fast, the kind people describe fondly right up until it becomes useful to describe it as something else. It was Ruby's disappearance that finally turned 3 separate missing persons files into a single homicide task force, and it was Ruby's disappearance, more than either of the boys, that Levi Marchetti would spend the next several years insisting, loudly and often, he had absolutely nothing to do with. I covered all 3 disappearances as they happened, filed the appeals for information, sat through the Camelot vigils on the foreshore that got smaller and angrier each year, watched the Facebook group dedicated to finding answers curdle slowly from grief into something closer to a mob with a rotating cast of suspects, most of them innocent, all of them made to suffer for it in the court of a town that badly wanted somebody to blame. It was 16 months after Ruby went that a fisherman working a set line below the old flume line snagged something heavier than fish and pulled a length of blue tarp out of the shallows. I was in Hobart when I got the call from a contact in the water police, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear thinking, with something like relief that shamed me the moment I felt it, that whatever this town had been carrying finally had a shape. Levi Marchetti was arrested 8 months after the tarp came out of the river, and I want to be honest about that stretch of time too, because I spent a good part of it in his company before anyone had laid a charge against him. He gave interviews readily in those years, sat across from me at his own kitchen table twice, always with his daughter's drawings taped to the fridge behind him, always insisting the police were chasing him because it was easier than doing the work of finding whoever actually did this. He had a way of meeting your eye that I mistook, more than once, for the plain directness of an innocent man, and it wasn't until much later, listening back to those recordings after his arrest, that I noticed how carefully he answered the questions I hadn't actually asked, filling silences with detail nobody had requested, the way people do when they've rehearsed a version of events so many times in their own head that it starts leaking out unprompted. He told me once, over instant coffee, that he'd loved all 3 of them like family and that whoever was doing this to his name would answer for it one day. I wrote that quote down. I used it in a story. I've thought about it more or less every week since his arrest. The town's temperature through those years ran from grief to suspicion to something meaner. While Coventry started a letterbox drop accusing 3 separate men by name, none of them ever charged with anything. One of them left the district inside a month, his OODA windows put in twice before he went. Deborah Kessler stopped doing her grocery shopping in daylight for a stretch, after a woman she'd known for 20 years told her, in the queue at the chemist, that everybody knew families always know more than they say. Pam Anstey, for her part, went the other way entirely, gave interview after interview, kept Ruby's face in front of every camera that would point one at her, because she decided early on that silence was how these cases died, and she was not going to let her daughter's case die quietly. When Marchetti was finally arrested, on a wet Tuesday morning with half the town's curtains twitching before 9 a.m., I was in Launceston covering an unrelated inquest, and I remember the strange, guilty lightness I felt reading the alert on my phone in a courthouse corridor 200 kilometers away. The sense that a story I'd been carrying around in my chest for years had finally agreed to move. I won't pretend those years cost me nothing. I missed a friend's wedding because I was covering the 3rd anniversary vigil instead, told myself I'd make it up to her, and never quite did. I got into the habit, driving home from Hartley's Reach late on a Friday, of stopping at the same servo outside Zeehan, and sitting in the car park for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to keep driving, because something about the empty highway at that hour let the weight of it catch up with me all at once. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from writing the word missing about the same family for 1 year and the word deceased about them the next, and I don't think anyone warns you about that in journalism school. I remember filing a story on the 2nd anniversary of Dez's disappearance, before his remains were found, under a headline I hadn't chosen and didn't love. Mystery of the missing mate deepens, and getting a call that night from Wall Coventry, who didn't shout at me, which would have been easier, but asked, very quietly, whether I thought his son was the kind of story that just deepened forever, or whether somebody, somewhere, actually intended to find him. I didn't have an answer for him then. I'm not sure I have a much better one now, sitting here trying to explain how a missing persons file becomes a murder trial becomes, eventually, just a thing a town learns to carry. The Hartley's Reach Courthouse is a squat sandstone building from the tin mining boom, with a portico too grand for the 2 rooms behind it, and on the first morning of the trial there wasn't space in the foyer to swing a satchel. Reporters from Hobart and Launceston stood in damp coats comparing notes. A stringer from one of the mainland networks kept asking anyone who'd listen where he could get a decent coffee, and outside on the steps a knot of jurors waited to be let in, none of them making eye contact with each other, all of them looking like people who'd rather be anywhere else. Jury selection alone had taken the better part of 2 days, which tells you something about how hard it is to find 12 people on this coast who hadn't already formed a view. The judge excused one juror who admitted unprompted that she'd gone to primary school with Deborah Kessler and still sent her a card every Mother's Day. He excused another who turned up wearing a football jumper for a club Marchetti had played reserves for a decade earlier, on the reasonable suspicion that a man who dressed for court that carelessly might not have thought carefully about anything else either. What was left, by the end of the second day, was a jury of 8 women and 4 men, ages ranging from an apprentice electrician barely into his 20s to a retired schoolteacher who took notes in a hand so neat I could read it from 3 rows back, and who would, I'd learn much later, end up as the foreperson. I saw Warwick Stiles working the hallway in his good suit and his R.M. Williams boots, the same boots he wore to every case I'd ever covered him in, like he thought they made him look like he'd ridden in from somewhere more interesting than his office in Devonport. He caught my eye, leaned toward the cameraman next to him, and said something I didn't catch, and the cameraman laughed too quickly, the way people laugh at things they're being paid to find funny. Deborah Kessler stood apart from the crowd, near the notice board at the end of the corridor, turning a sprig of dried leatherwood blossom over in her fingers the way some people turn a rosary. She'd taken to wearing a little enamel pin of the flower on her lapel every day of the hearings, ever since somebody told her that Flynn used to bring branches of it down from the ranges for her, because the bees loved it, and because, he said, half the reason people moved to a place like this was to see something white and stubborn grow out of all that gray rock. Pam Anstey stood a few meters further down, arms folded hard across her chest, watching the door like she expected it to open on something worse than what was already inside her. The two women had shared a hallway bench through 18 months of committal hearings and bail applications, and I'd watched something develop between them that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite its opposite. Both of them wanted the same man convicted. Only one of them had a daughter the Crown was prepared to call an accomplice. The three names, Des, Flynn, Ruby, had followed this town around for 4 years by then, but it was only ever one man's name on the charge sheet that first morning, and only ever Flynn's death he was compelled to answer for in full. By the time his trial opened, he was facing 29 charges: unlawful possession of firearms, threats made against half a dozen people in his old circle, and at the center of it all, the abduction, torture, and murder of Flynn Kessler. The Crown had given the file to Priya Nathan, a prosecutor with a flat, unhurried manner that had a way of making juries lean forward rather than away. She opened by walking the jury through the shape of the case without theatrics: a body dismembered with tools taken from a mate's tool shed, a length of copper wire that matched wire found in Marchetti's Uda, a blunt injury to the skull that the pathologist could not tie to any single implement, but could not exclude a machinist's hammer from, either. Somewhere in the middle of that recitation, I realized she had never once used the word Ruby. She talked around her the way you'd talk around a hole in a floor, careful not to fall in, careful not to point at it either. It wasn't until she read out a single line from a message Marchetti had posted to the group's old forum, "Wonder if one of us did the other two in," that the shape of what she wasn't saying became visible to anyone paying attention. Ruby was the Crown's silent second suspect, uncharged only because there was, as yet, nobody left alive to charge. Styles rose for the defense, looking like a man who'd rehearsed his opening in the mirror that morning, which he probably had. "They don't teach you at law school how you're meant to feel," he told the jury, "walking in here knowing that everyone in the room, before I've said a word, has already decided who my client is. I'm not going to stand here and tell you Levi Marchetti is a saint. By the end of this trial you might despise the man. But despising him and believing he murdered Flynn Kessler are two very different verdicts, and I intend to keep them separate for you, because nobody else in this room seems interested in doing that." He told them the case wasn't a story about one man's evil. It was a story about a small, hard, drug-soaked corner of a small, hard town, about people who loved each other and hurt each other in roughly equal measure, and he asked them to hold on to that distinction the way you'd hold onto a rope in the surf. The witnesses who followed did little to dignify the proceedings. One young woman, called to support an aggravated kidnapping charge, spent most of her evidence-in-chief informing the court, unprompted, that she had been using amphetamines heavily around the relevant period and that nothing she said should be taken as gospel. When the judge told her she'd need to return after the lunch adjournment to finish her evidence, she muttered something under her breath on the way out that the court reporter diplomatically declined to transcribe. A friend of Marchetti's named Corey Tavendale fared little better, first telling Nathan he couldn't recall Ruby ever expressing hostility toward Flynn, then, once handed the transcript of his own police interview from 18 months earlier, admitting he told a detective that Ruby had said, more than once, that she'd like to put Flynn's head through a wall if she ever got a clean shot at it. "People say things like that," Tavendale said, shrugging. "I tell my own brother I'll strangle him twice a week. Doesn't mean I've got a shovel in the boot." The Crown's forensic pathologist, Dr. Elaine Muir, spent the better part of a day and a half establishing what 4 years of Tide and Scavengers had left to establish. She spoke in the measured, careful cadence of someone who has given this kind of evidence in enough courtrooms to have stopped flinching at her own sentences, describing a skull fracture consistent with a single heavy blow delivered from behind and above, describing saw marks at 3 separate points on the recovered remains that she said, under further questioning, were more consistent with an implement such as a reciprocating or handheld rotary saw than with any natural process of decomposition or predation. Nathan asked her, plainly, whether the injuries were consistent with the account Marchetti would later give from the witness box of a single accidental blow from a cast-iron doorstop. Dr. Muir said the skull injury alone could not rule that account out. She said the same could not be said for what came after. Stiles, in cross-examination, spent a long time on the limits of what 4 years in cold water can tell a pathologist, and got her to agree, more than once, that a river does not preserve a story, it erases one, leaving behind only what refuses to disappear. A neighbor of Marchetti's, an older man named Trevor Sousey, who lived 2 properties down the Ridge Road and kept, by his own cheerful admission, not much else to do but watch the road, told the court he'd seen Marchetti's Uta go past his gate at close to 1 a.m. on the night in question, traveling in the direction of the river flats, its trailer light out, which he remembered because he'd meant to mention it to him and never had. He said he saw the same Uta come back up the road a little after 3. Under cross-examination, Stiles established that Sousey had given 3 separate times to 3 separate people over 4 years, none of them quite matching, and that he was, by his own admission, most of the way through a bottle of Muscat on the night he says he was watching a road nobody else could confirm he was watching. "I know what I saw," Sousey said, more than once, with the stubbornness of a man who has told a story so many times it no longer feels like a memory to him, it feels like a fact. The jury, I noticed, took careful notes anyway. Ruby's closest friend, a young mother named Chantel who'd known her since primary school, gave evidence that took the trial somewhere Stiles clearly hadn't wanted it to go and somewhere Nathan seemed almost reluctant to follow. She told the court that in the weeks before Ruby disappeared, Ruby had told her, more than once, that Levi frightened her, that he'd turned up at the pub twice asking questions about who she was seeing, that he'd said something to her outside the bottle shop she'd refused to repeat to anyone, including, it emerged, the police, until 18 months into the investigation. Under cross-examination, Stiles pressed her on why she'd waited so long, and pressed her too on Tavendale's account of Ruby's own temper, on whether Ruby had ever spoken about Flynn with anger of her own. Chantel didn't flinch from it. She could go off like a rocket and forget about it by dinner, she said. "That's not the same as what I'm telling you about him. His wasn't loud. Hers you could see coming. His you couldn't." It was, I thought, watching the jury, the single most effective sentence any witness offered in either direction across the whole trial. The Crown also called a man named Baz Lonergan, who had shared a remand wing with Marchetti for 6 weeks the year before trial, and whose evidence Nathan handled the way you handle a knife you don't fully trust the balance of, carefully, and with a visible awareness of how it might cut back at her. Lonergan testified that Marchetti had told him, during a late-night conversation neither of them expected a guard to be listening to, that it went further than the girl ever knew, a phrase the Crown argued pointed toward a version of events larger than the one Marchetti would eventually offer from the stand. Lonergan had 2 prior convictions for dishonesty offenses and an outstanding application for a reduced sentence that Stiles made sure the jury heard about in detail, in a cross-examination that ended with Lonergan agreeing, tightly, that a shorter stretch inside wouldn't exactly break my heart. Nathan, in re-examination, asked him only one question, whether anybody had told him what to say. He said no. Whether the jury believed him, "I couldn't have told you. I'm not sure the jury could have told you either." Marchetti himself sat through all of it in a collared shirt that looked borrowed, writing things in a notepad his lawyer had given him, nodding at points that seemed to please him, and staring at the table during the ones that didn't. Then, in the second week, Stiles did what defense barristers almost never do, and put his own client on the stand. Marchetti's version, delivered in a flat, rehearsed cadence, was this: that on the afternoon in question Flynn had come round his place agitated, that the 2 of them had got to talking about a woman Flynn had recently slept with, that Marchetti had made an offhand joke about a separate, unrelated allegation that had followed Flynn around for months, a joke Flynn had, according to Marchetti, taken as an accusation. He came up out of the chair like something had bitten him. Marchetti told the jury, "Grab the rifle off the rack by the door. My little girl was in the next room, 4 years old, and I've got Flynn standing there with the barrel swinging around like a compass needle that's lost the plot." He said Ruby had walked in from the kitchen at exactly the wrong moment, that Flynn had turned the gun on her, that he, Marchetti, had tackled Flynn to the floorboards, wrestled for the weapon, and that somewhere in the chaos Ruby had come down on the back of Flynn's skull with a cast-iron doorstop shaped like a wombat that had sat on that windowsill for as long as he'd owned the house. "There was blood everywhere inside about 4 seconds," he said. "I've never been so scared in my life. All I could think was, my daughter cannot walk into this room." He described, in a voice that stayed disturbingly level, driving to a friend's machinery shed, cutting Flynn's body down with an angle grinder and a bow saw because it was, in his words, the only way 2 people could move what needed moving, and burying most of the remains out past the old coach road before deciding, when a section went missing from the Uda tray somewhere along the drive, that the river made more sense after all. Detective Sergeant Ray Corbin, who'd run the investigation from the very first missing persons report, told me afterwards in the corridor that he'd never in 11 years on the force heard a man volunteer that kind of detail from a witness box. "For years he told me I was chasing my own tail," Corbin said. "Threatened to sue the department twice. And then he gets up there and tells a jury, calm as you like, that he cut a man up with a grinder. I don't believe half of what he said about who swung first. But I believe every word about what happened after." Nathan's cross-examination, when it came, was the most sustained piece of dismantling I've watched in a courtroom. She walked Marchetti through his own phone data and showed the jury that the tower pings placed him 14 kilometers from his house at the exact hour he swore he'd been wrestling a rifle away from Flynn Kessler on his own lounge room floor. She read back a text he'd sent Ruby the following evening, sorted the job out mate. "Took longer than I planned, but no loose ends this time," and asked him, without raising her voice at all, what a man who'd just helped bury his friend by accident thought he was tidying up loose ends about. She produced a photograph, taken on his own phone 3 weeks later, of Marchetti grinning at a barbecue on the riverbank not 400 meters from where the tarp would eventually be found, and asked the jury to note what was visible in the water behind his left shoulder. "You knew where his head was when you took that photo," she said. "Didn't you?" Marchetti said he didn't recall what he'd known at the time. By the end of 2 days of it, his own account had come apart in so many places that even the court stenographer, a woman who'd sat through 11 years of Hartley's Reach trials without changing her expression, was seen to put her pen down for a moment and simply look at him. Both barristers gave their closings on the same wet Thursday, rain loud enough on the courthouse roof that the judge twice asked counsel to raise their voices. Nathan reminded the jury that Marchetti had been given, mid-trial, the extraordinary chance to lead police back to the burial ground he swore existed, and that nothing had been found there but a fragment of bone too degraded to identify. "He had his chance to show you the truth was real," she said. "The truth wasn't there. Because the truth is he killed Flynn Kessler himself, and everything since has been an exercise in making sure nobody else pays for it." Stiles, for his part, told the jury a story about a friend of his who stood up every time his football team had the ball, convinced that sitting down might jinx the score, and said that human beings build small useless rituals like that because the world is chaos and it frightens us to admit it. "You want it to be one man," he said. "One monster, one reason, and then the world makes sense again, and you can all go home. But Flynn Kessler, Ruby Anstey, Des Coventry, 3 young people this town liked to believe were too golden for anything bad to happen to. That's not a story about a monster. That's a story about a river of bad choices that ran through all of their lives long before Levi Marchetti's name ever came up, and you cannot convict a man of murder because the alternative explanation makes you feel less safe in your beds. It was in the last hour before the jury retired that the court allowed something I'd never seen happen in that building before. A support worker from the Regional Victim Service, a soft-spoken woman named Allison Pettit, who had sat behind Deborah Kessler through every single day of committal and trial, was permitted, with both counsel's agreement and the judge's leave, to read a short statement on behalf of the family before the jury left the room. Not evidence, the judge was careful to say, but a statement the jury could choose to hear or not as they saw fit. Deborah stood beside her while she read it, holding the sprig of leatherwood so tightly I could see her knuckles whiten from the gallery. Flynn was 24 years old, Pettit read. He liked bad jokes, and he was terrified of magpies, and he used to ring his mother every Sunday whether he had anything to say or not, because he knew she'd worry if he didn't. Whatever you decide in that room, we are asking you to remember that somebody made a choice to take all of that away from her, and that choice had a name attached to it, and it is sitting at that table. We aren't asking you to be angry. We're asking you to be exact. Deborah didn't say anything herself. She didn't need to. Half the jury box was looking at the leatherwood pin on her collar by the time Pettit sat back down, and I watched two of them fail to look away in time. The jury was out 3 days. On the third afternoon, word went round the press room that a verdict had been reached, and within 20 minutes the corridor outside courtroom 1 had filled again with all the same damp coats and all the same cameramen, except this time nobody was talking. Pam Anstey found a spot on the bench beside Deborah without either of them saying a word about it, the way two people do when a hallway has become a kind of shared country. Stiles stood near the door in his good boots, arms folded, jaw set in the particular way I'd come to recognize as the look of a man rehearsing how to lose gracefully. Corbin leaned against the back wall with his arms crossed, watching the door like he'd watched 100 doors before it. I found a seat 2 rows behind Deborah, close enough to hear her breathing change when the bailiff called us to rise. The foreperson stood with the verdict sheet folded once in her hand, and the judge asked, in the flat, unhurried voice courts use for the biggest questions they ever ask anyone, whether the jury had reached a verdict upon which they were all agreed. She said they had. He asked her to hand the sheet to the associate. I watched Deborah's fingers close around the leatherwood blossom until the stem must have snapped, watched Pam Anstey's jaw tighten beside her, watched Marchetti stand very still at the bar table with his hands flat on the wood in front of him. The associate unfolded the paper, cleared her throat, and began, "On the charge of murder, we the jury find the defendant." The foreperson's voice caught slightly on the second word, the way voices do when they know the next sound out of their mouth is about to detonate something in a room full of people who have waited for years to hear it. "Guilty," she said, and then, because the court required it stated in full against each separate count, said it again and again, moving down the list of 29 charges one by one in a flat, unhurried monotone that somehow made each repetition land harder than the last, until she reached the count that mattered more than all the others put together, the murder of Flynn Kessler, and said it a final time. I have covered a great many verdicts in my working life, and I have never once seen a courtroom make the sound that one made, which was almost no sound at all. Deborah Kessler didn't cry out. She put both hands flat over her mouth and closed her eyes and rocked forward very slightly, once, the way you'd flinch from a blow you'd been braced for so long it barely registered as one anymore. Pam Anstey reached across without looking and took her hand, and the two of them sat like that, knuckles white together, while the judge thanked the jury for their service, and the associate kept reading. Marchetti's face did something I still can't fully describe. Not shock, I don't think anyone in that room believed he was shocked. Something closer to a man watching a door he'd spent 4 years leaning his whole weight against finally give way. Stiles put a hand briefly on his client's shoulder, The professional gesture of a man who has lost cases before and knows the difference between comforting a client and consoling one, and Marchetti shrugged it off, not unkindly, just absently, like a man checking whether his own arms still worked. Corbin, from the back wall, didn't move at all. I looked over at him once the noise in the gallery started to rise, and he was standing exactly as he had been for 3 days, arms crossed, watching the space where the verdict had just been read as though he expected it to be taken back. It was only afterwards, out on the courthouse steps in the rain, that I saw something in his face come loose. He didn't say anything to me that day. He shook my hand, which he had never once done in 9 years of my calling him for comment, and walked off toward his car without his umbrella. The judge remanded Marchetti in custody for sentencing and set a date 6 weeks out, and in the gap between the verdict and that date the town did what towns do, which is talk itself in circles. The pub with the chalkboard ran out of Sunday roasts 2 weeks running because half the district turned up wanting to sit somewhere and not be alone with the news. Someone left flowers, not Leatherwood but ordinary service station carnations, tied to the courthouse railing, and somebody else took them down within a day, and nobody ever established which gesture was meant more kindly. At sentencing, in early spring, the judge described what Marchetti had done to Flynn Kessler's body after his death as conduct that revealed a capacity for cold, methodical concealment entirely at odds with the accidental account the defendant offered this court, and sentenced him to 23 years, with a non-parole period of 18. Marchetti was given the chance to address the court before sentence was passed and declined it, which Deborah told me afterwards, in the corridor, was almost worse than anything he could have said. I wanted him to have to say something, she said, even if it was a lie. At least a lie is a kind of acknowledging you're being looked at. He was let out through the side door he'd been led through every day of the trial, and that, as far as the law of this state is concerned, was the end of the matter of Flynn Kessler. Stiles gave a brief statement to the cameras on the courthouse steps after sentencing, shorter than anything I'd heard him say in 4 years of hearings. He said his client maintained his account of what happened in that lounge room, that the sentence would be appealed on specific grounds relating to the Tower Ping evidence, and that he had nothing further to add. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who wanted very badly to be somewhere else, and when I caught him afterwards in the car park and asked, off the record, whether he believed Marchetti's version himself, he didn't answer straight away. My job was never to believe him, he said eventually. My job was to make sure somebody made the Crown prove it. They did. That's the system working, not failing, whatever anyone in this car park wants to tell you today. Then he got in his car and drove off toward Devonport, and I never interviewed him again. The mainland networks, who'd shown only fitful interest through most of the committal hearings, arrived in force for the verdict and left again within the week, already on to the next thing, the way they always are, and the town was left the way it's always left after these things, with the case gone from the news cycle and still, somehow, in every second conversation at the Servo and the Bowls Club for months afterward. It was not, of course, the end of the matter of Des Coventry or Ruby Anstey, and I think it's important, in telling this story honestly, not to pretend otherwise. No charge was ever laid over Des's death. The coroner's ambiguous finding stands exactly where it stood the day it was handed down, and while Coventry, when I rang him after the verdict, said only that he was glad for Deborah and that he hoped somebody, someday, might do for his boy what had just been done for hers. Ruby Anstey's remains have still never been found. The Crown's case always maintained, without ever quite saying so in front of a jury, that Marchetti knew more about her disappearance than he was ever compelled to answer for, and Chantel Weir's evidence sat in the trial record like a splinter nobody had managed to work all the way out. Corbin told me, the last time I rang him for the story, that the file on Ruby remains open, that it will stay open for as long as he has anything to do with it, and that he still drives out past the Flume line some Sundays. Not because he expects to find anything, but because he told her mother once that he would keep looking, and he doesn't think a verdict on a different name releases him from that. I drove out of Hartley's Reach the same way I'd driven in, through the 40 minutes of hairpin bends, past the smelter stack standing over the town like it always has, refusing on principle to fall down. I stopped, the way I always do now, at the lookout above the flume line, where you can see the river flatten out into the shallows before it reaches the sea, brown and unbothered, giving up nothing. Deborah still wears the Leatherwood pin. I saw her a fortnight after sentencing, at the little service the town held on the foreshore for all three of them together. Finally, one occasion instead of three, and she told me she thought Flynn would have found it funny. All of it, being the reason a whole town finally learned to say three names in the same breath instead of arguing about which one deserved saying first. Pam Anstey stood beside her the whole service and didn't leave her side once. I don't know what to call what's between those two women even now. I only know it's outlasted a marriage, a trial, and 4 years of grief that could easily have driven them apart instead of holding them together. And on this coast, in this weather, I've learned not to ask a good thing to explain itself. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. That was Leatherwood, an Emovura Audiobooks original. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.